So, interesting data about the distance from the road. And I was wondering what you think about, I mean, some of your later comments suggest there might be different reasons why distance from road matters when you get this U-shaped function. So, I mean, there's access to markets, there's access to medical care. So, I mean, your diet changes, but also you get access to medical care and population density, right? So, I mean, part of the worst of both worlds things is, I mean, as you know from being in these villages, if you're in a really remote village, not too worried about drinking out of the stream because you know nobody lives upstream.
Yeah.
Right? And then you go into these intermediate areas where they don't have plumbing and they don't treat the water, and you want to put something in the water before you drink it. And then you get into the city where you know they plug in the water or whatever. So I mean, I could see various different reasons why there might be U-shaped function. I'm wondering if in your data you could get at that. I mean, probably, maybe not. You have distance from,
I think,
but you have distance from medical clinic because there's
right, the health clinics, yeah.
Warming, albendazole distribution
Right.
programs. You could look at plumbing. But population density, because you have data that suggests that even within the household, the more people that are around, the more that might stress out your immune system.
I think for that bigger sample, we had a little bit of that, and we could look at water source, and water source was significant, whether it came from a river or from a stream.
Yeah.
We didn't know, we just said stream, it didn't say if people lived upstream or not. So this was from that anyway, was from the, they did this health diagnostic survey down there, and it was like a Shuar Federation survey data.
Yeah.
So there were some funny things in that data.
Just got the data.
We got that data. We have more and more of our own data coming in. So some things I think, as we go to more and more villages, we can measure. Let's see. I mean, we have measures, for example, just in terms of, so this is just scales in terms of ownership of items, so what people actually own, style of life sort of scale. And we divided it into traditional sorts of things and market sorts of things, and then type of house people have in terms of electricity and water and things like that. And you can see, so these are colonos in the first bar, and then Shuar that live in Sekua, Shuar in the Upano Valley, and Shuar on the other side of the Kuduku Range. And there are clear differences there in terms of ownership of items. So we're starting to get more and more of these sorts of measures come in as we go across Kuduku and get the rest of that sample. And you see the same thing actually. We have a food frequency questionnaire looking at dietary data. And these are the use the factor analysis on the food frequency questionnaire to look at what the major clusters were. And we can look at, this is consumption of things like rice, pasta, fats, and then Chicha loaded on this in the opposite direction actually. Colonos consume a lot of these, and the further you get out in the villages, there's less consumption of these sorts of things. Hunted game. We were surprised actually that came out pretty high in the Upano Valley villages, and not as much across Kuduku, but we still see that. Junk food is really high in the highest junk food consumption was the Shuar that lived in town in Sekua. So that's just an example, but I think maybe be able to test some of those things a little more before too long. Yeah.
So in talking about the positive relationship between CRP and height in the adolescents and adults, you discounted genetic explanations by appeal to the high degree of relatedness. But I mean, they aren't that closely related, and by the same kind of somewhat hand-wavy argument, you could say, well, they all live in the same village, so they all have the same pathogen load, right, or pathogen exposure, right? I mean, is there really a huge difference between households? Yeah, there probably is some difference between households. How many babies are pooping on the floor and that kind of thing, right? Well, since second cousins are more related than not, but they're still not as close as say full sibs or something like that. It seems to me that you can't rule out the possibility that taller individuals are of higher genetic quality, and that they can afford the high CRP levels as a sort of a stopgap measure, that they don't have to invest in, even if it has destructive collateral effects, they don't need to invest in high IgE because they can afford it, right? Whereas the shorter individuals, they can't afford the destructive consequences of having lots of CRP, and so, they have no choice. I don't know enough about sort of the standard ways these things are evaluated in the literature, and whether you can compare, say, between household differences in pathogen prevalence on the ground, sampling the actual ground, not the metaphorical ground, to give you a gauge for what the contribution of that, how much that varies as regards in comparison to how much relatedness varies.
Well, we do have relatedness. We have genealogies, so we might be able to put that into the analysis, I think, and try to track it that way. I mean, we have DNA. We have blood. We could do genetic markers too, if we knew what to look for, I think. So, I mean, I don't think we can discount that as a possible explanation. So, but there might be some analysis we could do to look at that. I mean, I think with the Chimani data I'm working with now, might be able to look at survivorship even, and that might be interesting if the individuals, I don't know if height and survivorship what that would look like. Yeah. But that might give us a measure of how resistant people are later on or something. Yeah.
I'm curious about the Z-score data, and you sort of did a binary analysis and chose to break off at 7, and I'm just wondering why 7 and why, like, if you did any analysis doing it with continuous age data?
Yeah, I did do it that way too. If you look at it, it was significant once you control for, if you just put all the kids in together, the IgE association between IgE and height is significant if you control for skin folds overall. And if you put in an age term, like as a continuous variable, it'll give you an interaction. Some of that's actually in the paper, because the way we ran it the other way around. The reason we split at age 7 or whatever, so there were a couple of reasons for that. One was that, I don't need to go back to it. If we looked at, where we saw sort of this transition in terms of the age-related transition between high CRP and high IgE, it was right around that age. And the other reason was that gave us 2 equal-sized samples of kids. Yeah, so that was why the split was at that point. Yeah.
Just to follow up what Dan said, I guess the relatedness was 0.02 something?
0.026. Yeah.
So that means that 97.5% of the variance of a completely randomly mixed population is in your population. So the argument that the relatedness, that's just a non-starter. And given that the heritability of stature in Western European populations, even highly monomorphic, homogeneous populations like Iceland, is like 0.8. There's, you'd expect a lot of genetic variations for height, and there are these recent GWA studies on people beginning to identify some of the genes that affect height, and they're not genes for overall genetic quality, they're just genes for height, and there's a ton of them, and they have additive effects, and it seems like who dad is, who mom is, ought to have a substantial effect on height. Less, it's quite possible, I guess, in this population the heritability is lower because there's more environmental variation that would cut it down. But it sort of seems to me your first guess ought to be that genetics ought to be real important. And even though you have this rather low level of relatedness in all the systems.
Okay, yeah, point taken. Yeah, like I said, you may be able to try to at least look at the relatedness coefficients between individuals and use that in the analysis somehow.
Can you calculate just the raw phenotypic correlation between parents and offspring, right?
Yeah, you can calculate that.
What's that?
I don't know what it is. I haven't looked at it, but
You're
yeah.
not making a sample, so you estimate variability.
Yeah.
If you make it bigger, you could, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if part of the argument is still that there's some calibration between the specific and non-specific immunological functioning that's calibrating the type of environment that the person's going to be in later on in adulthood. And if that's calibrating for the type of variation due to family composition that you were talking about in the second half. And if so, like how predictive is childhood family composition to adult family composition and pathogen load due to family composition?
So basically, you're suggesting that it's not just the general environment, but to the specific family environment that you'd be calibrating to?
Well, I'm wondering if that's part of the argument. Like, is it calibrating for variation due to family environment? That was a connection with the second half, right? Or no?
Yeah, well, that family environment was affecting that anyway.
Right.
Not necessarily that it would be predictively, that would be affecting your age at first exposure, and whether that would be, I mean, I suppose if there is a correlation between your own family environment and the likelihood of having the same environment in the future, that would be adaptive to calibrate to that. But it might just be that that's sort of noise around the central sort of simple mechanism of age of first exposure. Yeah.
And I wonder if there could be some effect, like differential between, I don't know if they're pathological or non-pathological, but there would be more predictive power for men versus women or something like that. Maybe not composition, but at least its application, maybe old people stick around in one of them. I don't know if there's some way of actually tracking the predictive
How
power.
predictive it is.
But this is where
Yeah.
people leave the house, right? I mean, regardless of locality, that's not the sole source of pathogen exposure. So I mean, I'm sympathetic to what Aaron said, which is there's a mechanism that is designed to calibrate, and it samples as best it can, but the sampling is imperfect because there's variation within the local environment. I mean, that would generate this.
Right.
It might not be the right
Ecological variation is relatively constant. But I was just wondering if it was an adaptive story for taking into consideration that cue, or whether it was just kind of other.
I think that's I don't know, that might be a little unlikely. Yeah. But
How much variation is there in either across age or across distance that people live from the road in exposure to either domestic animals or wildlife? There's pretty good data showing that there are high correlations between parasite loads in wildlife and humans, and I can only assume that it's that much stronger for domestic animals.
yeah, I mean, there is variation in that, definitely. You see more domestic animals closer you are to the road. If people are raising cattle in particular, raising it for sale, and yeah, less hunted game coming in. So there would be variation. I did run some stuff on ownership of animals, and I can't remember where I put it. Well, I can look it up later if you want to see. I think ownership of pigs was associated with higher IgE in the household, but not that many people owned pigs anyway, so it was just a couple of households.
And what about age?
Oh, and I think having more dogs was positive, but I don't remember for sure. What's that?
The other thing I was wondering about was age. Are there certain times in kids' lives where they spend a lot more time with animals, or is it just not make much difference?
Well, I mean, males anyway. If they're the ones that care for the cattle. So, but once they're teenagers or adults, as kids, probably not a whole lot of variation until you start to get a little older. Yeah.
The likelihood of stepping in cow dung is probably not the same as
Yeah, I would guess so. mean, yeah, maybe if you're more wrestling, you might roll in cow dung. I don't know, but yeah.
Always pick it up.
There is a consistent sex difference in IgE levels across all these populations I looked at. The males were higher in the IgE, and whether that's something fundamental about being male, or if that's an exposure thing, I don't know for sure. But I think it's, if you look at birth, though, males are a little higher in IgE too, so it seems to be something about being male. Whether that's predictive of the reason for that is because males are more likely to get exposed later, I don't know.
These pathogens are in all livestock. Like, can be transmitted from all types.
Pigs and dogs are actually carrying more zoonotic diseases than cows do.
Yeah,
Pigs in particular are pretty bad.
because they're so similar.
So I wonder with the tall individuals that have, I forget the acronym, so I think it was, are focusing, emphasizing the non-specific responses, right?
The tall individuals?
The taller adults.
Yeah, yeah.
So would you be able to gauge the effect of like the collateral damage caused by looking at longevity? So assume now that they are exposed to similar pathogens in the environment, would you expect that this was kind of
Bad choice not to invest in it?
well, to invest in the non-specific ones, and yeah, and then would they suffer? It would be kind of counterintuitive because
Maybe.
we assume tall people are going to live longer, right? On average, tall people live longer within a population, or is that not true?
In this population, it's probably true, but
So,
yeah.
right? So then, but then this would predict that the collateral damage would actually make them shorter lives because they're just not born fit. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so, unless for some reason there really are differences in terms of exposure and it really was a good choice, and that they're taller because they have more sanitary conditions, or they own shoes, or they have more wealth or something, or if there's a genetic component, then it might be a good choice then too if it's a quality thing. But might be able to find out what the, might have data to be able to figure that out. But
I only want to interrupt if you're done.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about the difference? Do you have any ideas on the difference between Shimane and Shuar?
In terms of
Well, I mean,
which,
the initial graph you put up there of the IgE differences, it looked like they're about as different from Shuar as Shuar are from American.
yeah, they are. They're like 10
I mean,
times
I guess
higher.
that might have been a log scale. So
It was log scale.
So even more so.
They're like 10 times higher.
Yeah.
Yeah, Shuar are like 10 times
So what's,
US.
do you have any? I mean, I don't know that much.
So,
about what the differences are.
Interestingly, the Chimane are actually taller.
Uh-huh.
And I looked at this though, and what it looks like, if you look at the Chimane are shorter as kids than Shuar. I'm not done analyzing this. I just started looking at this. I actually just submitted a talk for this. The AAP is this year, but Chimane are actually shorter as kids, but then they catch up and get taller in their teenage years, and they end up taller adults than the Shuar. And the Shuar are taller when they're younger, and then level off more. And I think it might have to do with this, where'd my talk go? This timing of when this peak shift. So you've got this peak shift in, here we go. Right, so you got this peak shift here where Chimane are getting exposed earlier and investing earlier. And what you see is that Chimane are smaller earlier on, and then presumably they develop enough immunity and then catch up because it's not interfering with their adolescent growth spurt. That's an idea anyway. And that Shuar, since they're getting exposed later and closer up to their adolescent growth spurt, and that maybe ultimately that's having more of an effect on adult height because of the timing of the exposure. So it's interesting that it actually looks like maybe lower pathogen levels leading to poorer growth ultimately than having the higher pathogen and developing immunity to it earlier on.
They reach puberty at the same age? Any
Uh,
differences between the population?
I haven't looked, but probably.
I was just thinking, I mean, 'cause I would have guessed that, that, you know, ranking in terms of sort of, I mean, I don't know where your Chimane field site is, but it's farther from the road than most of these trans-Kudu sites, right, in Shuar land, so.
Yeah, it's
I would've thought
there's
you would've-
definitely less access to medicines.
But
And there's
could it be
definitely-
the dip of that U that you showed, kind of?
Yeah. In terms of,
Well, you showed.
they have more game and stuff
Sure.
than the Shuar do, the Chimane do, and they run around without shoes a lot more. And they have less access to albendazole and
Yeah.
other things like that. It's interesting though, but yeah, why they seem to have higher levels, I'm not exactly sure what the mechanism is. Yeah, or because there are too many variables. I think there's all these other things that are different, like their households are spaced differently,
Yeah.
which I would imagine might have an effect. But they're more spread out, so I would expect that to decrease transmission.
I think Brad.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
about it.
All right.
Thank you.